Hello chess friends! So, as you saw that this was a thumbnail and also the video name and the description. Today I'm going to talk about some basic tricks and tips which every chess player should know. This video is basically for all the beginners who has just started to pursue chess or play chess as an hobby. This video would be quite a large video, but make sure to watch the whole video because this is a very interesting as well as educational video. So, before wasting time, let's get started. The first thing in a chess game is development. We should develop all our pieces in the starting of a chess game so as to make an attack on the opponent and start winning the game. So I'll show you some moves which are very important in development. We need our pawns in the center just like this. Our knight should be mostly in the c3 and f3 squares. And our bishops are very useful in the c4 and f4 squares. Now here you can see that our pieces are making a sort of barrier like position to defend our king. So these pieces also act to defend our king, as well as you can see that the bishops are covering most of the squares in this diagonal. The knight has so many squares to jump into. And also the pawns are very strong in the center, covering 4 of the central squares. Moving on, now let's see what is the second most important thing we should know being as a chess player. The second point that we should know that we shouldn't move a piece twice or thrice in the opening itself. This leads the opponent to develop its pieces, as well as our pieces would be crammed inside our own territory. Let me show you an example. We can take a main line in the openings that most of the people play, that is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we can play the royal pass, which is bishop to b5. So here the amateur players think that we are attacking the knight, so we should move the knight. So they would often move the knight such as knight to d4, but we can see that the knight has moved twice in the opening only. But we won't do that. We don't need to capture their knight and waste one move in that. We would just develop a move and play knight to c3 or some other move. Now amateur players can respond with knight captures knight, and we'll capture with the queen. Now here you can see that the black's knight played 3 moves, wasting 3 moves. One was knight to c6, then knight to d4, and then capturing a knight. The black pieces wasted 3 moves, but it led us developing our minor pieces as well as major pieces. From here we can launch an attack, and you can see that black's pieces are crammed inside their own territory. The third main thing is that we should grab the center with our 2 pawns. I mean to say that we should play e4 and d4 as quickly as possible and grab the center. Here you can see that we have played e4 and d4 and grabbed the 4 squares in the center, which are very vulnerable to us. This doesn't allow the black pieces also to develop. I'll show you how. You can see that if the black pieces develop the knight to f6 just like this, then we can push our pawn and kick this knight. Moreover, if this knight is kicked off, such as knight to d5 like this, then we can push our pawn and kick this knight once again. After this knight goes to some squares such as knight to b6, we can also kick it twice with this pawn push, or else we can also push d5 to kick this knight. So by this you can see that the 2 pawns in the center are so powerful. They control so many squares in the center and also don't allow the opponent to develop. One more main thing that we should know in chess, that we have to safeguard our king, because only the minor pieces and the major pieces can save the king. So let's see how to save our king. Let's see a game which starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, and we can play d3 or such moves. From here, the opponent will reply with pawn push or castles or any move, and we will take out our bishop. So from here, you can see that all our minor pieces are developed. Now what we have to do is we have to castle along the king side so that we can bring our rook outside as well as we can defend our king. I'll show you how. After some moves, we castle. Now what is the main quality of castling? That our rook comes out of the h1 square and our king is so safe in the g1 square that it is safeguarded from the f2, g2 and h2 pawn. So no one can enter this territory and kill the king. Castling is a very important move, and many players and coaches also suggest we should castle before 10 moves, or else it would be trouble for us if the opponent's pieces would come into our territory and threaten our king. Let's see one more main thing which we should do in the opening itself. The opening stages end when the rooks are connected, and we should always connect our rooks because the rooks at the corners are not so important that they are important in the middle. Let me show you how. Let's say this game. Here we have castled and we have to just move our queen, such as queen to d2 or queen to e2, and then our rooks are connected. So after the rooks are connected, we can bring the rooks to e1 and d1 respectively to gain this d and e files. And these are very important rooks. And these rooks are very important, covering these files to allow our development as well as protect pieces and develop more pieces. One more important thing, that if we have the bishops in the board, then we should keep the position open. I mean to say that let's say we see a game in which all the pieces are exchanged in the starting, and you can see that our bishops are opened and the position is open. So this bishop will have more space in the game and will be more powerful than the bishops which are crammed in its own position. Let me show you a game in which the bishops are crammed and are not at all useful. In this position, you can see that these b2 and c2 bishops are so terrifically placed. The c2 bishop can't come out from b3 nor a4 because the pawns are defending there. It can't come out from the b1 to h7 diagonal because our pawn on e4 is blocked by the pawn on e5. Now if you see the b2 bishop, then it's so terrific that it is covered by its own pawns. It can't go from here nor from here. If it tries to come out from here, it would take so many moves. So this is why you should keep the position open so that your bishop can freely move and be very strong in the game. Now let's see a case with the knights. So let's say this position. You can see that this position is locked by all the pawns here and also by our pawns here. So from here you can get to know that how vulnerable are the knights in closed position. You can see this strong knight on d5. It is so strong that no piece can take it out from the d5 square. There is no pawn on the e file and as well as the c file which can hit this knight. Also, there is no white square bishop who can take out this knight. So this knight covers so many squares in the opponent's territory, which leads to crampation in the opponent's position. So that is why we should keep the position closed when we have knights on the boards. One more thing is that we should keep our rooks on the open files, because in an open file a rook is very powerful, as in sitting lonely in the corners. Moreover, I suggest that we should attack in the whole game after our opening stage is completed, because if we go into defense, our position itself gets cramped and the opponent gets more variation in which it can attack and defeat us. So it is my personal advice that we should attack and attack in the whole game, which would lead to crampation in the opponent's position, as well as our pieces would move ahead and no one could stop them to attack. So now let's see something about pawns. Many a times people think that the pawns are the weakest pieces in the entire board, but that is totally disagreed. I especially like the pawns the most, more than the queens, because if the queens get exchanged and also the minor pieces get exchanged, then in the end game the pawns are the one who can decide the result of the game. It could be only one move by which we can win the game or entirely lose the game. Let's see some special abilities and things that pawns can do. So from here you can see that white pieces have 5 pawns, whereas the black pieces has only 4 pawns here on the board. But you can see that on the G file we have doubled pawns, and these double pawns are very bad in endgames. You can see that if any pieces such as this pawn on G4 stops the pawn, then both pawns are nothing. They doesn't even act like a single pawn. So this is the disadvantage of double pawns. Now let's see some advantages of double pawns. So you can see that I added one rook to each side. By adding just one rook, the result entirely changes. The last position it was a draw, but whereas here it would be a clear win for white. Do you know why? You can see that here the double pawns are an advantage for white's position. If the G3 pawn were at F2, then you won't get this file, F file, for the rook, which is acting so good in this endgame. So these were the advantages and disadvantages of doubled pawns in our position. One more thing about pawns is they make islands in the endgame. Now what is islands? Islands are the group of pawns which are separated by some other pawn with a file in between. Now you can see that the H2 pawn make one island because it is separated by the F3 pawn with a G file. The F3 pawn is also one island. The C4 and D5 pawn also make one island, and the A4 pawn also makes one island. So in short, that we have 4 islands in the white's position here. But in the black's position, we can see that we have 3 islands. So this is just a concept to learn about endgames, but this doesn't matter so much. But the main thing of islands is that when a single pawn is there, then it is not supported by any other pawn, so it becomes very weak. So this also leads to a concept called isolated pawns. Now let's check out about isolated pawns. So now you can see that this position has an isolated pawn. What is an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is a pawn which has no other 2 pawns on its 2 adjacent files to support it. Here you can see that the D4 pawn is an isolated pawn because the C file and E file pawns are being captured by other pawns or other pieces. So this isolated pawn is very weak because to defend this pawn we need some minor pieces or major pieces. But to defend other pawns we have the 2 pawns beside them. So this isolated pawn can be took as an advantage by the opponent by placing a knight in front of it, because a knight in front of it cannot be pushed by the adjacent pawns because they are not there in the board, as well as it stops the isolated pawn from advancing. Also, this isolated pawn can be took into advantage by attacking it many times by pawns as well as minor pieces, so as to capture it and gain an advantage. Also, we have something called passed pawns. These passed pawns are often seen in endgames. You can see the pawns of B5 and C5. Passed pawns are literally the pawns which are free to move ahead and cannot be blocked by any other pawn or cannot be attacked by any other pawn. If this D4 pawn were at D7, then these 2 pawns won't be a passed pawn because the d7 pawn takes the area of c6 as well. Since this d4 pawn is at d4 and not blocking the way of these two pawns, thus these two pawns can be termed as isolated pawns, and they are very strong as they can defend itself and also advance and become a queen in the near future. Going on, let's see an ability of pawn. So you might only know one ability of pawn becoming a queen, but there is one more special ability of a pawn known as en passant. It is also called en pass in short form by many players and grandmasters. So this ability states that a pawn can move diagonally without a pawn or a piece being in the diagonal. Let me show you with an example. Here we have a pawn on b5 and the opponent plays c5 in the next move. Then we can take the c5 pawn by just playing en passant. This means that we can go b captures c5 by placing this pawn on c6, and this pawn is gone. You can see that this ability to go diagonally and capturing the pawn adjacent to it is called en passant. But this ability only happens when our pawn is next to the other pawn and the pawn next to us has just played two moves in that previous move itself. If it were that we have played a move such as h3 here and the opponent played b6, then from here we can't do en passant. This can't be possible because two moves have been passed away by playing c5. So only in this move we can play en passant because the pawn just came to c5 by playing two moves, and we can go b to c6 and capture c5 pawn. So now I know it's kind of boring because I've taken so much time of yours, but now we are going to the end of this video. We are done with all the main things that a beginner should know, and also many things about pawns which looks like they are not so vulnerable, but they are vulnerable more than the queen in a position. So now let's check out something about endgames. So this is the position. You might be thinking, why are the kings outside? They should be in the last rank so as to be protected. But this is the ability that king shows in the endgame to finish the opponent. It supports our pawns, the player's pawns, and helps them to become a queen in the near endgame. So note, in the endgame, when all the minor and major pieces are exchanged and only pawns or a small minor piece is left, then you should not keep your king in the last rank or safe in the corner, but it should come like a king inside the game in the center and help our pawns to win the game. So with this, I'd like to end the video. But one thing I want to say, that you shouldn't play fast in chess, because chess is a mind game and the mind needs to think. You might have seen many players playing fast in many tournaments. They are because they have experienced. But if we are not experienced at all and we are just starting chess as a hobby or to pursue it, we should play slowly and tempt our opponent to play fast, so that the opponent makes blunders and we can take advantage of it. So with this, if you like the video, then please subscribe. So with this, if you like the video, then please comment and like this video, and also subscribe my channel if you haven't, because I take so much hard work to make such videos for you all. So stay safe and play chess. Goodbye.